Well, good morning. Another Monday is here. I'm going to talk a little bit more. I can usually come up with stories behind the photos I've taken and memories that come with those, and that's kind of what I'm doing today. Let me fix my camera a little bit. There, that's better. You can see my goozly chin. This is a headlight upgrade. All we were doing was changing the bulbs for some of those brighter ones. I don't remember what the bulb was that we were replacing the original ones with, but you can really see a big difference. Now, sometimes when the bulbs are the really bright blue ones that they have that are just ridiculously bright, it kind of ticks you off whenever you meet somebody at night and somebody's got those things on because it drives you nuts. These right here were basically just a nice white, clean light, that was far reaching. Of course, it's always a good idea to have the headlights adjusted properly if they have adjustments, so that you're not shining them up in the face. And if your suspension's a little weak in the rear, or you're carrying something heavy in the back, you don't want to have those lights shining up there. A lot of people don't realize that when you adjust headlights, you can actually take tape and put it on the wall that's even with the height and the spacing of the headlights. And if it's got horizontal and vertical adjustments, you can get 25 feet from that wall pointed straight at it and adjust it so those lights are, whenever you got them on bright, they need to be pointing straight ahead at those places. A little, there needs to be a nice flat wall, and you need to be perpendicular with it, and you put the masking tape on the wall in a sort of an X or whatever on each side, and it needs to be the same height off the floor of the headlights, and they need to be the same distance apart. In other words, your vertical tape will be the same distance apart. Your horizontal tape will be even with those. 25 feet from it, you can adjust the horizontal and vertical so that it's pointed like that. That's all you need to do if you have a place to do that. Now, a lot of these headlights nowadays don't have a horizontal adjustment, but they do have a vertical adjustment. And some headlight assemblies don't have any adjustment at all. But one way or another, you can see a big difference when these headlights. This was the original bulbs. Obviously, this was the original. That's the new one, and that just made a huge difference. This is a '66 model pickup like Dad's, only his was a 3/4 ton. And this is what one of those things cost back then when they were new, $1,700. And a lot of people around here had these trucks. And this was basically Chevy country. There were a lot more people that had Chevys than Fords, and Dad had a Chevy that was the same color as this one, long wheelbase like this one. But once again, his was a 1.5 tons. It was a 20, C20. And the funny thing about that was he sent me one time to the local vault place to get some gravel. It was a place where they had gravel and sand and all that kind of stuff, and they also did vaults and stuff and septic tanks and blah blah and all that stuff. And so I said, okay. So I pulled up there on that old truck, and it had coil springs on it. Didn't have leaf springs. And whenever you squeeze a coil spring all the way down, it's gone as far as it's going to go. And the guy says, I said, I need you to put as much gravel on this truck as you can get in there. If you can get a yard in there, that's what I want. And of course the truck wouldn't quite hold a yard, but he says, this truck's not going to haul as much gravel as you're putting in. And I said, just put it in there, let me worry about that. So he put that truck in the gravel, and it was actually even with the bed back here. And that thing, you could tell it had squatted down some, but it couldn't squat down much because them coil springs can only squeeze so much. And when I drove away from there, he was really surprised. And that old truck hauled that gravel famously, and it was a monster. But when Dad got the truck, he paid $600 for it. It was a repo at the bank, and it had a straight 6 in it. And I was trying to pull up out of some wet grass. I wasn't but about 16 at the time, and I had done a lot of driving and a lot of dirt road stuff and all. But for some reason, that truck, the revving when I was trying to pull out of that wet grass off the road, trying to keep from getting stuck. I don't even remember why I was on the side of the road. And the old engine in that truck started a rod knocking because I revved it a little too high. And so we wound up having to put a 283 in it. Managed to find one of those, and that basically V8'd the old straight six truck and made it better. It didn't cost all that much either back in those days. You could get a used engine in those days for like $150 and you know, stab it in there real quick, and you could change it out in about 4 or 5 hours. I rebuilt the engine in a truck like this about that, well, right after that following Christmas, when my folks went to Texas. This farmer had a truck that his hired hands used, and he hired me to do an engine overhaul on a straight six. It was in a truck just like this, except it was short wheelbase. And I tell you what, putting the hood back on this truck by yourself, and I was in the shop by myself working on it after I got the engine rebuilt. I was putting the hood back on it, and that big old hood right there, putting it on by yourself, and I had to get up on the thing and prop it up on one knee and hold it on the other hand and start some bolts and all that. And I wasn't but 16 years old when I did it. That was really tough. This is procrastination, you know, a pathway to trouble that could have been. How many times have you seen where somebody had put the donut spare on and then the donut spare went flat? Well, what now? You know, what are you going to do? So this was a pathway to trouble that could have been avoided, basically. All they had to do was get their other tire fixed or get another tire or whatever. This one here could have happened at a worse place. I noticed it was sitting at a hotel with a flat tire on the rear. The important part to remember about donut spares is the donut is smaller than the one on the other side. You notice this one is on the rear, so it didn't hurt anything because it's a front wheel drive car. And if you put the donut on one end of a drive axle, those differential gears are really going to be working to beat the band. Usually the differential gears aren't doing anything other than just turning with the carrier, unless you're making a curve, and then they work against each other a little bit so that one wheel can roll faster than the other. Okay, so if you put a tire that's littler on one side than on the other side, those gears are going to be whirling all the time, and some of these Asian cars will destroy the differential if you drive too far with the donut on the drive axle. You know, I actually drove with a donut on my drive axle on my Taurus, but not very far. One time, whenever I went to my father-in-law's house after he had passed away, I was going down there to check on the dog and all that, and it was right next to a little country store. I parked out there, drove all the way 30 miles from work, parked out there, went in to check the dog's water and food and all. I went in there 5 minutes, come back out, and some smart aleck yo-yo had stubbed a knife in the side of one of my tires, and so I had to change the donut and put it on that one. And I never did find out who did that. But one way or another, here is the situation with those donut spares. One day I was driving home from work about, I don't know, 6 years ago, and I was on my white Explorer. Of course, I was wearing my uniform with the patches on it and all that. And I saw this black Cadillac sitting out there beside the road with two women in overcoats standing next to it because it was really cold. And I pulled over just past the car, got out and looked, and they had a flat. And I said, yeah, you got a problem here. So I opened my hatch and got the, they were speaking with a British accent. I thought that was kind of interesting. Well, I got my jack out that I carry with me, and I jacked it up. You know, I broke lugs loose first with my four-way, and jacked it up, went changing the tire. And about this time, this record driver pulled up. And he said, I wish I'd have got here sooner. And then he and I started talking about he said, shouldn't that donut go on the end of the car where the drive axle is not? And I said, well, yeah, but this one here is, if you'll look, it's the same diameter as the original tire. So they, Cadillac did that so you wouldn't have to worry about that. So I said, this is not going to be a problem for them. And he was wearing a bomber jacket and blue jeans and all that kind of stuff, and I was wearing a mechanic's uniform, And so after I got through changing the tire, I was putting my stuff away, and one of those women says, well, do you have a ticket for me to sign or anything? I says, no, I'm just on my way home from work. And it was about that time that I realized that they had already called AAA, and AAA had sent that guy on the wrecker, and he had come out there to change the tire, and he got there after I was about half through changing the tire, and they thought I was the AAA guy. That's why they didn't say anything, because I was in a uniform. and I had patches on my shoulders, you know, ASE and all that. But that was funny as all get out. I didn't realize, I wouldn't even have done that if I'd have known they had called AAA. I'd let them wait for him. But I accidentally stole a, you know, road service call from a AAA guy. Anyway, that kind of was just a happenstance thing there. I checked my own spare tire the other day, and I got under there. It goes on, you know, 2006 Explorer. Notice this tire was built the 36th week of 2005, and look at these cracks. Thinking, you know, this would be a disaster waiting to happen. If I was on a trip somewhere and I had a flat and I had to put this dadgum spare on there, this thing would probably blow out before I went 20 miles, because this is old, you know. My wife's truck only has 7,000 miles on it, and it's a 2016 model, and the warranty on tires is gone after 6 years. But I did some research, and Michelin says their tires are actually safe for 10 years, but after that you need to replace them no matter what they look like. And her tires look like brand spanking new tires, but if you do the math, they're already out of warranty. Even though they're Michelin tires, they came on the truck new, and the truck's got almost no miles on it. But one way or another, we'll eventually have to buy some tires, and somebody's going to be, you know, probably wanting to take those Michelins we pull off of there and put it on something else. But, you know, I don't want us going on a trip on her truck with tires that are more than 10 years old and may separate on us and all that. You know, that can be really dangerous. There was a big hullabaloo about that back in the Bridgestone days, you know, whenever there was a class action lawsuit against them because some of the tires were separating because they were on Ford. And I knew one guy that lost his dad to an Explorer that flipped over because the tires separated. They got that straightened out. But anyway, I had to go and buy a tire, and this was full-size spare. And so I took the tire up there to the local Road Mart, and they got me a tire. Seems to me like they found me a tire for like $85 or something, which is really, really cheap. But it wasn't really you know, the best of the best tires. It was about the cheapest tire you could get this size. Anyway, so that's got a new. But get under your car and your truck or whatever you drive and check your spare tire, and make sure that you got your jack, lug wrench, and everything you need. It's not a bad idea to have one of those little portable inflators if you got a leak that's not that bad. But if you need to change a tire, you need to know how to change a tire. One time there was this girl that came down there to the shop when I was working at college. She worked in the office, and she said, she was like 20-something years old. She said, can you look at my car because I'm getting ready to take a trip. And she was a single girl, you know, she's only traveling by herself. And I says, have you ever changed a tire on this car? She says, no, I don't even know how to change a tire. And I says, well, today, if you'll do so, I'm going to let you change a tire here in the shop where it's safe. And so I showed her where to find her jack and her lug wrench, and I showed her how to jack the car up on that level concrete, and I showed her how to break the lugs loose before she ever started jacking it up. She changed that tire all by herself right there in the shop, and it was something that she knew how to do. She was confident that she could change a tire. Of course, I told her, make sure you're always on level pavement and don't, put the jack in the dirt and, where it can sink in and dump the car. I gave her all those pointers. But anyways, also a good idea to carry a piece of wood with you. So even if you're on level ground and you jack it up in your own grass and dirt, you're going to have some issues there if that dirt's a little bit soft. Or even on hot asphalt, believe it or not. I've seen that happen, but usually you don't have that trouble on hot asphalt. But you can if it's hot enough, because it gets soft. One way or another, she put her old tire back on and torque the lugs and all that. And she checked all her air pressures and everything else on the car because she was going to make a trip. She goes home. She tells her dad. She comes back and says, my dad said he was really glad that you taught me how to do that because he had never even thought to teach me how to change a tire. Some vehicles come without spare tires nowadays because they just assume you're going to call a wrecker anyway. But that's kind of a crummy deal because you're going to have to have your vehicle towed if you don't have a spare. Teslas don't have a spare, and so on and so forth. But anyway, gumption and grit. I see pictures like this, and I basically borrowed this picture and I created a motivational poster with it. I make a lot of these motivational posters with pictures I've got. But this right here, I see these all the time, and you see these pictures of these guys without shirts on under a tree changing out an engine in an old Dodge Charger or something. And the thing about it is, in this part of the country, around where I grew up, none of my buddies knew anything about cars. But I mean, I worked on them because I worked on them at gas stations, worked on them with my dad and all that kind of stuff. And I typically was the one that was doing what you see right here, and the rest of them didn't have a clue. So it's not a universal thing that every teenager, back whenever, now that all the pictures that were taken back then have turned sepia tone, it's not a foregone conclusion that every teenage boy you saw was like this boy here. Some of us were, some of us weren't. I did know one other guy that was a really good mechanic, and he knew more than I did back then. But one way or another, it wasn't just widespread that every guy worked on their car back then, because even though cars were simpler, a lot of guys that really didn't know what to do. This is Entropy. I made this motivational poster from around the corner several years ago. This car was sitting there, and I noticed it had been sitting there long enough where it was sinking into the dirt. This is entropy. Entropy, it means that everything moves from order to disorder. It's like a second law of thermodynamics. You don't have to do anything for it to work. You might even notice when somebody moves out of a house for a while, the house just starts to deteriorate because they're not living there. It just seems like it happens automatically. And it's fully automatic. This car will eventually, if you leave it sitting there 1,000 years, it's going to be a rusty hulk. If you leave any vehicle sitting too long, the gas gets rotten, the tires get rotten, the engine, gets to where it, of course, some of them are totally amazing how they seem to do okay. And older cars, like from back in the, 50s, 60s, and 70s, they could be sitting for 2 or 3 years, and they would still start on the gas that was in the tank with those little carburetors. I've seen that. But these fuel-injected vehicles, if they had rotten gas in there, either wouldn't start at all or they'd run bad. And so that's just, but the longer you let one sit, cars are made to be driven, the longer you let it sit, the more it's going to do like you see right here. Note the pattern on these right here. The first time I ever changed out a ring gear and a pinion, I didn't have any training. It was back, when I was a very young guy. And I noticed that I put a new ring gear and a new pinion in there and just put them in there like I was putting a puzzle together. Didn't set them up, just put them in there. And when I drove that thing down the road, it just sang and whined and all that. And I said, good grief. So I called this guy that I knew what he was talking about. And I said, how in the world do I set these gears up? And he says, paint the gears like you're painting your porch, turn them through and make the pattern. This is the pattern. This is the gear contact pattern right here. You got pinion depth and you got backlash you got to set. So you're going to move this back and forth, and you're going to bring your pinion in closer or farther away. And there's actually little illustrations you can find, and I used to teach my students this, how to do this. And we set up some rear ends and stuff when I was at the college. And one time I was working, and I don't know if I told this story or not, but I was working at the International dealer, and it was an International Scout 4-wheel drive that came in there, and the differential housing on that one had popped right here. It had broke, and this gear had waggled around. Now, if you drive these gears, if you drive the vehicle with the gears out of line too wrong, because something's gone wrong in there, if you drive it a long way like that, if you're able to, you'll mismatch those gears, because these gears are a match set, the ring gear and the pinion. And nothing you can do will make them quiet after that, except putting banana peels in there or something like that. And so I asked Bert, the guy that owned the vehicle, I said, how far did you drive this thing with this busted differential carrier? And he said, I didn't go very far at all. But it turned out he had driven a lot farther than he told me to, because we got him a $65 differential carrier, and I put it in there and I set it up with his gears, with using this pattern and all that, just like it's supposed to do. And I drove it, and the gears were noisy. And I said, dadgummit, he mismatched the gears. I should have sold him gears to start with. And so the boss man, he said, there is a differential with the same gear ratio off a Scout like this laying down there behind the shop. Go get the ring gear and the pinion out of that one and put them in there and set them up. And so I went down there and I took that cover off that thing, and it was full of water, and the gears were all rusty and pitted, and it was a mess. And I told him, I said, we can't do this. This is ridiculous. These gears are just totally rusty. I mean, flakes and pits. And he said, just put them in there and see how they do. And I said, hell, you're praying me, I'll do it. So anyway, I put the gears in there, And of course, on what I do if I don't have any marking compound or Prussian blue is I just use grease. You can put grease on there too. And I turned them through and made all the adjustments and got it set up. And that was the quietest rear end I think. I couldn't believe those rusty pitted gears were as quiet as they were. But I guess all those rusty pits gave that wall somewhere to be. I don't know. That was incredible. But anyway, that was just a story. You might notice this is a positive traction rear end with those springs in there. This is schematic version. Whenever you're looking at a Lexus relay and fuses in the Lexus shop manual, now schematics have changed over the years. All schematics aren't. I mean, a lot of schematics are interactive now, and you'll see them online like that, where you can highlight one wire and it'll highlight it all the way from one place to the other, so you don't have to trace it and all that. That seems to be something they really enjoy doing. But this right here is what a relay looked like in the Ford shop manual and in some of the earlier GM shop manuals, and there's a bunch of shop manuals. Honda shop manuals look surprisingly like Ford shop manuals in the way that they drew their stuff. Lexus got theirs like this. And the switches, I thought these switches were very interesting, the way they did them with Asian cars. See, this is how Ford drew theirs, and GM and all. They'd show you a ganged switch, and it would you're moving one switch or moving them all, So this one here, you might notice that whenever you got various different switch positions, these particular two terminals are connected, and when you're in headlights, those three are connected. When you're on low beam, So it's just really interesting how they chose to draw the switches. You can figure it out if you look at it and think about it. But if you're used to seeing this and you see this, you're saying, what? And if you see any of those track diagrams that they use on Volkswagens and stuff, that's the ones I cut my teeth on when I first found out about wiring schematics when I worked at a Volkswagen place. For 6 years I worked on cars with no wiring schematics. And I was just basically flying blind, This is a wiring schematic from a 64 Chevy. You might notice they've got everything that's on that car that's got wiring, from the headlights, the distributor, the ignition system, the alternator, the dash, all that stuff. See all that stuff right there? They got them all labeled really good. Now I had to put 2 pages together, and you can see where this doesn't quite line up right, but it's the same schematic with the same wire colors and all. Even got the starter in there, and they're showing the field coils and all that. See how they drew stuff back then? Wasn't that incredible? 1 page. And nowadays they got, many pages of wiring schematics, and they go from one page to the other. Some of those schematics, particularly on Chryslers, you may have to flip through 6 or 7 pages to find out how the dash lights, get their power and work. It's ridiculous how you run you from one page to the other. It turns into a page flipping odyssey, Now this one here was a slide that I created about relays, and whenever you're checking a relay circuit, if you energize a circuit, however it needs to be energized, like turning it on with a PCM or mashing a button or whatever, you should have 2 powers and 2 grounds. Now this one here will usually, this is the common terminal, this one here will usually be the one that has power, but not always. Sometimes this one will be the one that has power, but depending on how they wired it up. This one here, this is the coil on this ISO relay, but it's all different kinds of relays. And a lot of times they'll have a little schematic on the side of them. But if you've got several terminals in there, usually if you got 2 smaller terminals, those will be the ones that are doing the coil. Like on this kind right here, these 2 terminals across from one another are the coil, and the other ones are the load carrying terminals. This one here is one of those GM style, and all the terminals are the same size, and it'll plug in either way because they're across. The coil terminals are crisscross from one another. It's like an X, and the load carrying terminals are the other way. So if you flip it around, plug it in backwards, it doesn't matter. These are some old Asian relays. Used to use those too, and I even built a box to check relays out. But if you turn on the switch, like say it's a ground, you ought to see a ground. You ought to see a ground coming through your load, and you ought to see power on these 2. If you've got power, ground, and ground, now this middle one's the one that's normally closed whenever the relay is not energized. These 2 will be together. But if you turn that switch on and you don't see a ground here and a ground here, you need to find out either if you got switch issues or a circuit, or an open load or a circuit there, and on this one right here, you got to have the coil powered up and you got to have power coming in. So that's just basics on that. Of course, you get your battery power, and I kind of put that together, and this tells you how the relay is put together on the inside with the points and all that. There's also a clamping resistor in there that I'm not showing you here, although you can, if you look carefully, you might be able to see it on there. But it'll be wired parallel with the with this coil, so that there won't be a spike whenever the relay de-energizes, because you don't like spiking your computer. This is an alternator. Basically, this is a Ford style alternator, Motorcraft, but all the alternators pretty much work similar. When I was working on forklifts back in the 70s, they had an external regulator, and on the GM alternators, if you looked at the terminals on the regulator, it was field, R terminal, battery, and then I terminal. The I terminal, even on those old remotely mounted regulators that were grounded to the fender or whatever, the I terminal goes through the light and turns on the regulator, even if it's an external regulator. So this is really important. If this is shorted to ground, you'll have a battery light, even if the alternator is good, and the alternator will not put out. So if this is shorted to ground, the alternator will be not charging. You can put an alternator on there and it still won't charge. But what you need to do is, if you disconnect the wire from right here, or you disconnect the wire from your alternator, the small wire, not the big one, and if that light's on, when you disconnect that alternator, that light should go off. Now, this is without the engine running, okay? Alright, so if you disconnect it and that light stays on, and of course a lot of times you'll have the computer and the instrument cluster turning the lights on because there's a network and all this kind of stuff. But on the kind that's where it's hardwired like this, and a lot of them are, when you see the I wire, it's the one that always needs to get voltage, even through the bulb. You notice that resistor that's jumping around it? If that bulb blows, that resistor will turn on that regulator. Okay. One time I had a guy that had a rental car place sent a brand new car to me that the alternator wasn't putting out on. The battery was going dead. And I noticed, switched on the key, the charge indicator would not come on when I switched on the key. If you switch on the key and the charge indicator does not come on, you better find out why. And so when I went looking for why, I pulled the instrument cluster and there was no problem with the circuit between here and here, and there was power coming in here, but that light wouldn't come on. And when I looked a little closer, some yo-yo had rented the car, some Yankee soldier from up north, and he was going to get smart, and he was going to take the speedometer apart and roll the miles back so he wouldn't have to pay for those extra miles. And he wasn't really all that good at what he was doing, and he tore the printed circuit, and he interrupted the circuit to the charge indicator. And because the charge indicator circuit was interrupted by that torn printed circuit, the alternator wouldn't put out. Okay, so if this is broken somewhere, if this is broke, then you're going to have no alternator light when you switch on the key. When you start it up, if the alternator light is still on and this is not putting out, you may very well have a bad alternator, but you need to unplug this and see if that light goes out. See? So most every time though, like 99,000 times out of whatever, you're going to have a bad alternator. Of course here you got your field, that's a rotor that's spinning. Now what I ran into one time, this right here has to have power for the regulator to sense what's in the battery, and also to feed the field on these Ford ones. And that's this regulator right here. You can change out without any trouble at all if you know what you're doing. The brush carrier is built onto it. But I saw one time that was overcharging, like 18 volts, and it just kept going up. And I said, good grief. I measured the voltage right here. The voltage right here was reading 12 volts, but the voltage at the battery was reading 18 volts. And what we had was there was a connector in this wire right here that was pushed back so that it was barely touching, and this vehicle wasn't very old. And that voltage drop on this circuit right here caused it to overcharge. I had another one on a motorhome that would overcharge when I would rev it up, but it would charge normally idling. And I said, well, that's got to be a voltage regulator. So I went pull that alternator off that motorhome, changed out the voltage regulator. That didn't fix it. And so I realized that the field, the part that spins when it's connected to the belt and pulley, had to be full fielding itself because of a short when it due to centrifugal force. That's the only time I've ever seen that in my whole career. But when I changed the regulator and it didn't fix the overcharge problem, it had to be something wrong in the alternator itself, and it was right in this area here. Of course, you got these right here. If you hear one that's whining and growling and all that, you might think it's bearings, but if it's got a stator where the windings are all cooked and shorted, it'll make a you ever heard a ceiling fan go wing, 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 and that's a magnetic resonance thing going on when the stator's like that. But anyway, that's another thing. I could talk a lot more about alternators, but I'm going to move on. Pinouts are important. If you're checking something, I had talked about this one a while back, it seems like, where I had to replace a pretensioner. And this is I had found a better image of this, and I didn't really have this image when I made that other video. But whenever you find out what the pins are that are feeding these pretensioners, so you know your pin numbers, then get this connector, because you're looking into the connector when you're looking at this, and when you find the pin numbers that's going to this, and that's what I did here. I basically went to those two pins that fed that, and I measured right here. You got to be careful. You got a little single strand copper wire to measure the resistance. You can unplug, and I did this. I measured the resistance of that pretensioner. They say not to do that because you may light it off, but I figured nobody's going to die if I light this off, and it's not going to be, like lighting off an airbag, so. But anyway, I found out this was open whenever I measured from here to here. Now, it could have been a problem with the circuit, but it turned out that pretensioner had opened up and it was turning on an airbag light. But that's your airbag module and that's it. So if you know how to find those pins, and you know how to find the pinout, and you know how to read the schematic, you can fix a lot of stuff that other people won't be able to figure out. This was an ignition trainer board when it was under construction, when I was building it. And this thing was pretty darn cool. There's a video on my YouTube channel of me using this to teach. But anyway, so yeah, I started out with points over here. I would hook this thing up to this ballast resistor and connect the B plus to it, and I would turn that distributor, and you would see this go pop, 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 pop. Well, then I would hook this DuraSpark ignition up to it, and then you could basically make the spark the same way, although I didn't have a distributor connected to this one right here. Basically, you could demonstrate the operation of the ignition system using that. So, but you got to kind of know how these are. Well, actually, I did have a distributor. That's a lie. I knew better than that. This is a Ford distributor, and I connected this to here. That's what I did. Okay, so when I connected that to there, you could turn this distributor, and it would fire that same coil. This is an old Chrysler ignition module. You might notice here, these two go to the pickup coil in the distributor, and this one's power, and that one's ground. Now there's another terminal on some of these, but this one here only had those. And so I had bought this from the parts store, and if you wired this up, you hook this up to the coil, to the negative side of the coil, and you hook that to power, and you shorted those two wires together, it would go pop, 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 pop. I was thinking, man, you could take a set of points and just have it trigger in these and make that Chrysler module fire the coil. I never did that, but one time I did take on my old 74 F100, just horsing around, I took a Chrysler module and a Ford electronic ignition distributor, because my 74 model had points in it, and I connected this module to a Ford distributor, and I had to retard the timing to get it to start because the reluctor teeth on one of these Chrysler distributors are real sharp, and the ones on a Ford distributor are fat. So anyway, I got that thing to run, but you had to retard the timing to get it to start like a Model T, And then when I advanced it, I could actually drive the vehicle with this silly Chrysler module in the Ford distributor, but it was not practical because I don't have to retard the timing every time I started it. This one right here, it was pretty cool because I had this wired up, and you could hook power. You hook power up to the little coil terminal up here. And see these two terminals right here that hook to the pickup coil and distributor? If you touch this with one hand and tapped those two terminals right there with your other hand, this little spring would go pop, 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 fire would jump out of that. And I used to ask students, hey, you want to make a spark with your hand? They said, no, I'm good. And I'd show them how it really worked. We used to check, I learned at GM school in 1981 how to check these, these GM modules like that using your hand and, just tapping the pickup coil terminals with everything else fired up. This one here, I had a distributor. You'd have to wire this up. They'd have to wire this up. And there's a TFI module. And I made all these plug wires the right length so it would look neat, and you could turn off the lights because it wasn't fun to watch with the lights on, and spin that distributor by hand, and it would pop, 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 pop. It would pop these in order. I had a PCM over here, and this I actually eventually made a hardwired connection to the pins 21 and 22, which was right here on that crank sensor. And then you would hook these up to ground, hook it up to power, and then whenever you push the, I had a button where you could push to light this, to start this crank sensor spinning. I had to use a fan motor that I put in there in a big O-ring to drive that thing right there. But it would start its firing, pop, 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 you'd see all these walking through here. Had to wire this up too. They had to wire all this up. This taught ignition system better than anything I could have bought anywhere, and it was like the evolution of them all the way up to coil pack. I didn't have room for cop coil, so that's why I didn't have cop coil on there. But I did have to have a engine controller, which I had all of this stuff in. I used to just lay it out on the table and show them how to do it, but I figured I'd mount it on a board. I don't know whatever happened to this. I left it at the college whenever I retired. The guy that's the instructor now probably threw it away. This fans will smoke out resistance. A lot of time you'll find somebody say, well, my blower motor doesn't work. Whenever you look at the blower motor resistor, it's all cooked and burned up like this. You got to put a pigtail on there. This one right here off the Ford Fusion, likes to fail like that. See how it gets hot and oxidized? And so if you just clean the terminal and put a new thing on there and clean the terminal and plug it in, it's going to do it again. So you put a pigtail and the blower controller on there. Smart way to do it. This is belts. I got this from Gates. Gates knows what they're talking about. If Gates is telling you anything about belts, you need to listen because they know what they're talking about. We don't often think about that, but if you look at the grooves, the bottom of the grooves in the belt, and you see it all polished, then that typically means there's enough wear to where the tips of these pulley grooves are touching those. And if they're touching and it's not gripping on the sides like you see right here, a belt that even looks decent and doesn't have any cracks can be worn out and will hydroplane when water hits it. There's a water channel right here, and you're gripping the belt like that. See how these things can wear out? We don't often think about that. This was the birth of a failure. Chevy Vegas were a disaster. They actually spent a lot of time in the laboratory trying to prove out this engine, make sure it was going to be okay. Put it out there, and these aluminum block freestanding cylinder wall 4 cylinders was, some of the first ones GM built. Cadillacs went with this same freestanding cylinder design later, but one way or another, this was a disaster. These are beautiful little cars. Some guys, some hot gearheads I knew would put V8s in these things, and they were really scary with a V8 in them. But that was something. Mike, the guy that I worked with back in the 70s, he said GM had a good Iron Duke engine they could have put in that little car, and they had to tool up and redesign to build something sorry. These power window struggles are something else. This was one of my grandsons, Tyler, and I had taught my boys how to replace power window regulators, and so they taught, Luke, the youngest one, the oldest boy, hadn't had to teach his that yet because his power windows are still working on his pickup, but these boys learned how to replace power window regulators because both of them, two of his 3 grandsons had power windows that crapped out, and he bought regulators, made those boys change the regulators themselves. But a lot of people will pull up to the drive-thru and open the door and do their business because they don't want to have to pay nobody to fix the power windows. And I've often said if you just had a power window shop, you could probably do better than you think, because a lot of people are driving around with power windows held up by tape. I don't know how many of those I see all the time. This was my dad in our living room in 1976. This was a little bitty house we lived in because our previous house had burned, and we had a black and white TV that would pick up one channel, and you notice we had a antenna here with on that thing. But you notice how many books and magazines we had. No internet, no cell phones, no screens to look at other than that little black and white screen. And on Saturday night, Lawrence Welk was playing on there, and that was the last thing I wanted to watch. But anyway, my dad meant what he said, and he said what he meant. And no was no, and yes was yes. And if he ever told you something that had happened years ago, if you heard him tell this, sometimes if somebody tells a story again years later, it'll have different elements to it. Like they embellished it the first time or maybe the second time. But every time he ever told me anything that happened, it was exactly word for word the same as he had told me the first time. He always told the truth, and he was an inspiration to me. He always was. This was my leg with a piece of steel in it about the size of a .22 bullet. I had safety glasses on, but I should have been wearing, I guess, a canvas apron. I was beating on this thing with the students around. And this thing, a chip came off of the edge of that thing. It was a harder pin than I should have beaten on. Went into my leg. I lost about a pint of blood in about 2 minutes. But I bandaged it up myself using the shop rag and gauze, shop rag, and masking tape. And went to the emergency room. Had to spend the night in the hospital. And the vascular surgeon said, I could go in there and dig that thing out. It's about an inch away from your femoral artery, but he said it'll build a hard cocoon around itself. It's not going anywhere. We'll just leave it in there. He says, because digging in there to find something that small, he said, I'd have to make an incision about 6 inches deep and 4 inches long. He said, it'd take you a long time to get over that. He says, just leave it alone. And I really always appreciated that doctor telling me that. And so that thing's still in my leg. I can't have an MRI done because there's no telling which way that piece of steel will go. And it's about an inch from that big old artery in there. But boy, that blood was coming out of there, and it was all over the floor in the bathroom where I was sitting. I just sat down and took my britches down and fixed that because it was really high up on my thigh, But anyway, we got it fixed up. But that's one of those things that wearing safety glasses is good, but a piece of steel like that can come off and hit you anywhere. So you might better keep that in mind too. It went right through my pants. Anyway, that was the end of that video, and we've been here for 42 minutes. I hope you guys made it to this point. Let me know if you did. Last week, one of my videos, somebody made a comment on it, said, this looks like it's AI generated. Well, I don't know if I'm supposed to be flattered by that or if I'm supposed to be insulted, but I thought that was really funny. Anyway, y'all have a great week, and I'll see you next time.